So Noshim uktanim pturim in Talmud Torah. That's the Rambam's opening line. Noshim, the Gemara says, they are not obligated in Talmud Torah because only someone who has to be taught Torah has to learn Torah, and only someone who has to learn Torah has to teach Torah. Women are excluded from all these three, A, B, and C, because the pasuk says, "V'limadatem osam es benechem, benechem v'lo benosechem." So therefore, a woman doesn't have to be taught Torah, and therefore she doesn't have to study Torah, and therefore she doesn't have to teach Torah. And the structure of the therefores here is not really what you call, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the phrase siba u'misovev. It's not, cause and effect. It's really just a gili milsa. I mean, this is the way the halacha and biblical exegesis operates. That if we want to know, you know, uh, whether these two mitzvahs, are interdependent, then we invoke a gzera shava, and here there's a gzera shava v'limadatem. Only someone who's included under v'limadatem, which means has to be taught, is included under v'limadatem, has to study, and we have a gzera shava that only someone who has to study has to teach Torah. So a woman is out, not included in any of these three categories. But when it comes to Katan, life gets a little bit more complicated. In the case of a woman, I understand that the Gemara has to go through all these different yalfuses, all these different derivations and gzereshavas and principles in order to establish al patur, because there are many mitzvahs that she's obligated in. In fact, any mitzvah that's lo azman groma, that's not time bound, women are obligated like men. And for example, in the case of Talmud Torah, that's that's not a time bound mitzvah. Talmud Torah is 24/7. But in the case of a katan, we're not sure that the Gemara would have gone through this whole rigmarole to ask and determine based on Gzereshavas and Yalfuses that a katan is excluded from Talmud Torah, because a katan is excluded from all mitzvahs. He's not obligated in any mitzvah. You can't point to any single mitzvah that a katan is chayav in. The Torah tells us that a mitzvah is obligated upon ish, and ish excludes a katan. And in fact, a katan is included all the lota. He's excluded from all the lota says. I mean, he's not even enjoined, not to do this, not to do that. Whole sugya in Yavamis, whether we can feed him, non-kosher food and so forth and so on. A katan doesn't have mitzvahs, period. So to raise the issue of how do we know that a katan doesn't have to teach Torah? How do we know that a katan doesn't have to study Torah? How do we know that a katan could not be taught? But all this is irrelevant, because as we say, it's a lo matchil. It doesn't get off the ground because katan is potter from all mitzvahs. But yet, the Rambam, in his opening few words, finds himself compelled to tell us that a katan is not chayiv in Talmud Torah. And I don't think that the Rambam has to go kechuchlo tlu. In every case, you go ahead and say, well, this mitzvah, that mitzvah, katan is potter, and 365 times he has to repeat himself that a katan is potter. Perhaps the answer lies in the fact that with regard to Isha, the Gemara actually addresses a serious havamina that a woman is obligated in the study of Torah. And the reason for that is because Acherim might be chayiv to teach her. In other words, before the Gemara quotes the pasuk, "V'limadatem osam es b'nechem, b'nechem v'lo b'nosechem," it crosses the mind of the Gemara that a woman should be chayiv in Talmud Torah, and therefore she should be taught Torah. If she's taught Torah, if there's an obligation on us to teach a woman Torah, then she has to study Torah. And if she has to study Torah, she has to teach Torah. So again, it's like a chadgadya here. It's like a domino theory. We start with asking, do others have to teach, in this case an Isha? Then we go on to say, well, if they don't, then she doesn't have to study, and then she doesn't have to teach. On the other hand, the dominoes could have fallen the other direction. if not for the drasha of B'neichem v'lo b'nosechem, you would say the following. Others have to teach her. So like, let's say a father has to teach his daughter Torah, and therefore she has to study Torah, and therefore she has to teach Torah. So again, it's a it's haba atalia, meaning these are methods by which we derive conclusions about who's obligated and who's exempt from a mitzvah. And the Gzera Shaveh of Limadatem Lamadatem is going to really, fill in for that and give us an idea as to whether or not so and so, in this case, an Isha, is chayiv in Talmud Torah. But the main thing is that we're working here with what I call Gzeres HaKos. We're willing here with klolim, with principles, with derivations, we establish a certain chiyuv based on a derivation. We're not going to ask logical questions here. We're not saying, well, logically, how can we say that a woman has to teach Torah if she doesn't have to study Torah? The Gemara never raises that as a question. The Gemara says it all depends upon whether others have to teach her Torah, and therefore she'll have to study Torah, and therefore she'll have to teach Torah. But nowhere does the Gemara say, well, why should she be obligated to teach Torah if she doesn't have to study Torah? No. We have to, everything has to stand in its own analysis with its own derivations. So now we come to a point in which there's a principle called Acherim Mitzuvim Lelamdo. Those are the three.
Rabbi, may I ask a question or make a statement? I can't speak for Canada, but in Jerusalem, I can say from my own knowledge, and I'm sure you're aware of it too, there's an exceptionally increasing level of study by women about Torah. I mean, just on the next block from us on Keren HaYesod, Abad just opened up a school for teenage girls for learning. And no matter where you look, I mean, I'm not saying it's mandatory. Please do not misunderstand me, but I'm saying it's becoming very accepted here in Jerusalem, and it's becoming very common.
Okay, that's a good point. So B'li Neder will take this up under separate advisement. There's a Magen Avraham that says a woman is obligated to learn that which she needs to know, and there's also a Minchas Chinuch that seems to say a woman has to learn all the philosophical principles that underlie Judaism. There's a lot to talk about in terms of women in Talmud Torah. In fact, I created a seminary, I don't know if you ever heard of it, called MMY. And in MMY, there's a teaching Torah to women on a very high level. But what I wanted to focus your attention on today, just for the remainder of the time that we have for us, is the Katan. What's the story with a Katan? Is there really a necessity to go through this whole rigmarole that the Gemara goes through by Isha with this limud and this Gzera Shaveh and the entire Chad Gadya, this whole chain? Do we have to go through that with regard to Katan, or is it just simply enough to say, you know what? A Katan is not chayav in mitzvahs, period. Doesn't matter whether it's 612 mitzvahs or whether it's the mitzvah Talmud Torah. A Katan is not chayav. A Katan is a lav bar chiyuv. A Katan is a Katan. He's not an ish. And if he's not an ish, he's not included in any mitzvah. No mitzvah, not even losas. Which again leaves me with a little bit of an uncomfortable feeling as to why the Rambam felt compelled to tell me that a Katan is patur from Talmud Torah. Why would I think otherwise? But what I'd like to suggest, and this is the derech halimud that I like to apply whenever I can, a derech that I learned from my Rebbe, Rav Soloveitchik, and that is what's called din kloli and din misuya. In other words, din kloli means there are certain principles that imply in general. Din misuya means there are exceptions to that rule, and there may be a whole new set of rules and regulations that apply to a din misuya. And I'm just thinking out loud that it could be that Talmud Torah, as a mitzvah amongst Taryag, stands on its own. and that the general din and klal that determines who is chayav in 612 mitzvahs does not necessarily apply in the question is who's chayav in Talmud Torah. Because Talmud Torah might be a din misuyam. It might be classified as a mitzvah that divides itself and separates itself from all the other mitzvahs with its own rules and regulations. And perhaps the proof of the pudding is that an Isha is Petura for Talmud Torah. She's exempt. And why is she exempt? She's exempt not because it's a Zman Groma mitzvah. It's not a time urgent mitzvah. It's a 24/7 mitzvah. 7 days a week, 30 days a month, 12 months a year. It's on and on and on. I mean, the only time maybe that you're not chayav in Talmud Torah is perhaps on Yom Kippur and Tisha B'Av. Well, I shouldn't say Yom Kippur. I should say Tisha B'Av. But even then, don't hack me with Tisha B'Av, because the truth is that even on Tisha B'Av you're chayav in Talmud Torah. But it's a different kind of Torah. I mean, you should be learning, Dvarim Haraim, Shabir, whatever it is. But there's Talmud Torah on. In fact, the longest shir of the year was for us as Talmidim Rav Salvation was always on Tisha B'Av. That was the longest shir. Went from 9 in the morning till 5 in the afternoon, nonstop. But be that as it may, you have to admit that Talmud Torah is a mitzvah that is not time bound. There is no moment of time that excludes or restricts Talmud Torah. You're not exempt at any point. And therefore, the Gemara wants to know, in the case of Talmud Torah, there must be some fluky kind of limud, a kind of exceptional drasha or yalfusa that's going to teach me that a woman is part of Talmud Torah. And the Gemara says that it really boils down to analyzing whether others have to teach her Torah. That's where it really begins. So the exclusion of a woman, or let's call it the accept. What word did I want to use? The how do you say in English? The ptur, the exemption. That was the word I wanted to use. Sorry, the exemption of a woman is based on the fact that we don't have to teach her Torah. How do you know, says the Gemara, that we don't have to teach her Torah? Because it says, "V'limadatem osam es b'neichem," and you have to teach your sons, but not your daughters. V'lo b'nosechem. Once we have that, and she's not obligated to be taught, meaning we don't have an obligation to teach her. Memela, she doesn't have the obligation to teach Torah, and she doesn't have the obligation to teach Torah, to study Torah and to teach Torah. So again, do you understand what I'm trying to say here? I'm trying to develop a theory here that when we want to establish who and what is chayv in Talmud Torah, we are bound to certain rules and regulations, certain klalim. And those klalim are very unique to the mitzvah of Talmud Torah. And we're not going to ask, in tzitzis, well, does somebody have to force you to wear tzitzis, and therefore you have to wear tzitzis, they have to force somebody else to wear tzitzis. All those mechanics don't work over here. But we have a system established by the Gemara Kiddushin on Chavtes as to how to determine if Gavra X is chayev or is part of the Talmud Torah. Now, if that be the case, that we're dealing with, shall I say, legal principles and what we call exeris hakos, rules and regulations. We're not dealing with, pure human logic. And logically, we might come to the conclusion that a woman should be studying Torah. But the Torah says we don't have to teach her, and therefore she doesn't have to learn Torah, and therefore she doesn't have to teach Torah. That's the way it is. That's the way the Gemara has it based on klolim. Do you understand what I mean by klolim? I don't hear you. It's got to be based on rules and regulations. These are the rules. So don't invoke rules that apply in Kol Torah Kulu Mitum. Those rules have no bearing on Talmud Torah. Talmud Torah l'chud, the Kol Torah Kulu l'chud. Mitzvah zu l'chud, v'shara mitzvahs l'chud. They're two separate categories. So those rules that apply to general mitzvahs might not apply to the mitzvah Talmud Torah. And I quote to you Isha as a proof text, because the rules that apply in general to mitzvahs would lead me to the conclusion that a woman is obligated in Talmud Torah. But no, we have Gzeira Shava of Limadatem Lamadatem, and that's going to teach me that women are exempt from Talmud Torah. But Rabbosai could go the other way. Once you're introducing new rules and regulations, and you're telling me that if others have to teach you Torah, then you're obligated in Torah. If others do not have to teach you Torah, you're exempt from Talmud Torah. Then I'm going to apply that even to a Katan, because I'm no longer bound by the rules of what we call a din klali that apply to mitzvahs in general. The 612 mitzvahs, you ask yourself whether you're an ish or you're not an ish. And if you're not an ish, then you're exempt. But when it comes to Talmud Torah, there's no ish or not ish. When it comes to Talmud Torah, the question is whether others have to teach you. And guess what? Others do have to teach you. Whoa. You know what that means? That sets up a whole Chad Gadya over here. We have now a whole cause and effect kind of relationship, a rolling relationship that if others have to teach the Katan, that means, according to the rules that are established vis-a-vis Talmud Torah, the Katan has to study himself. And if the Katan has to study himself, he's going to have to teach Torah to others. Obviously, I'm going to make distinctions between a 3-year-old and a 2-year-old and a 10-year-old and an 11 or 12-year-old, obviously, and then one Katan is precocious and he's brilliant, and the Gaon revealed the new Torah at the age of 6. They say he knew it backwards and forwards. I don't know what. They never said that about me. So that we now come to the conclusion that if others have to teach Torah to X, and the X here is a Katan, then the Katan has to study Torah himself. And maybe that's because, again, if you want to give philosophical ideas, because Talmud Torah is so critical, Talmud Torah is intellectual, and maybe the child is intellectually capable. He doesn't have the maturity for mitzvahs in general, but he might have the intellectual acumen and the capability of studying Torah. But that's all on the side. That's, for a Shabbos drasha. What's for us today is that the rule of thumb is the following. If others have to teach you Torah, you are obligated to study Torah. If others do not have to teach you Torah, you're not obligated to study Torah. And whether you have to teach Torah depends upon the same thing. Once we establish that you have an obligation to study Torah, you have an obligation to teach Torah. Misha chayev lilmod, chayev lelamed, and that we derive from Gzeira Shava. That's also one of the klolim. And Misha eino chayev lilmod, eino chayev lelamed. And Isha eino chayeves lilmod, and therefore eino chayeves lelamed. But in the case of a Katan, we have a whole different story here. Because in Isha, really the kickoff, the beginning of it is that others don't have to teach an Isha. How do we know that others don't have to teach an Isha? Because there's B'nei v'lo b'nosech. We have an explicit mute. But in the case of Katan, it says B'neichem. B'neichem means even a Katan, and we have to teach the Katan Torah, and therefore, according to the rules that are set up by the Gemara, a Katan should be chayev to study Torah. But here I want to raise a question. And again, this is something that I studied from my Rebbe. I'll just mention it since we're recording the Shia now. I wasn't intending to, but if we're recording the Shia, the Rav was talking about the difference between an Isha and an Eved. You know that an Eved, we're talking about an Eved Kanani, is chayev in mitzvahs like an Isha. Any mitzvah that a woman is chayev in, an Eved is chayev in. Any mitzvah that a woman is exempt from, an Eved is exempt from. And that's based on Gzeira Shava called La, if you've ever heard of it. So the Rav used to say the following. There's a difference between an Eved and an Isha in those mitzvahs that they are exempt from. A woman is a ptur. An Eved is a hafkah. And gentlemen, if you'll bless me with a good bracha, I hope to publish a book on my Rebbe's Derech HaLimud, and this would be an entire chapter because I have many, many examples in which I try to illustrate the difference between a ptur and a hafkah. And I might even have it in my next sefer, which is a Mirtzah called Oz LaMelech, which I haven't touched in 20 years, and I want to get back to it. And that's part of the reason I'm giving you this shir, because this is what I'm working on right now. The Rambam Hilchos Talmud Torah. So wish me luck on that. My mother used to use a phrase, Rebbe-gelt. Did you ever hear that phrase? No? You weren't raised on that phrase? My mother used to say that the first time you undergo something, you pay a lot of Rebbe-gelt, meaning you learn all the hard, pitfalls. So I published a book. I'm hoping you'll all get a hold of it. I tried to send some copies with Bobby. It didn't work out. But whatever it is, it's called Hagige Oz. I'm not going to tell you how much it cost me per copy. That's not for you to know. But the point is that now that I finished that sefer, and I learned a lot of Rebbe guilt, I made a lot of mistakes, not in the text itself, by the way, or the concepts, but a room in a room. So many mistakes. I can give you a long list. So I learned all my Rebbe guilt, and I'm hoping that for my next sefer on the Ram Hilchos Talmud Torah, it'll go a little bit smoother. But then again, I thought the same thing about Masechta Menachos. And I thought that the more I learn Menachos, the easier it get. And yet it gets more and more complicated. So I had a Zoom share today with a couple of guys, 5 guys, whatever it is, on the plot in Menachos. And don't publicize this, but I probably understood about 50%, if I'm lucky, of what we learned. It's getting harder and harder, Menachos. And I thought of dropping it, but after 5 years of Daf Yomi, like I see the end zone in this and the Ofik and the horizon, I might as well get to the end zone. You know what I mean? Another 2 years. I don't know. I don't know if I'll survive, Menachos. But
Well, hold it. You got to continue to 120. You just go through another
no,
cycle.
no, 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 no. No, no. Listen carefully. When I get to the finish line, I'm not going back to brachas again. Ich hab gehat genug. Okay, I'm not going to tell you what I call the Daf Yomi. I have a different name for it, DD. I'm not going to tell you what DD stands for, but we won't go into that. But the
I
bottom,
have a question on what your share today. What
good.
about the obligation to teach a grandson who is a Katan?
Oh, come on. Listen, you know what? You're bringing me into other issues. I can talk to you about a grandson for years. Let me
Forget it. I
just
didn't ask the question.
Yeah, no, 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 don't distract. Let me get through Katan. So, again, getting back to Katan, is there a Havamina? Is it logical and it would cross your mind that a Katan is chayiv in Talmud Torah? And I say the answer is yes. Why? Because the general rules that apply to a Katan with regard to 612 do not necessarily apply to a Katan at the age of 613. And I'm sorry, in the 613th mitzvah, what I call Talmud Torah. And there's a very strong push to conclude that a Katan is chayiv in Talmud Torah. And if anyone wants to fight with me on that, they have to fight with me on that.
But the Rav
I'm ready to
in the
fight.
middle. The Rav was in the middle of the difference between a woman and Evet Kanani. That's what the Rav
Right.
was
So
in
I
the middle.
wanted to say that there's a concept called a ptur, and then there's a concept called afka. And Rav Soloveitchik used to always say the following, that in the case of an Isha, when she's exempt from a mitzvah, that's exactly what it is. It's a ptur. It's an exemption. In the case of an Eved, it's not just an exemption, it's a hafka'ah. Hafka'ah. I'll spell it for you in case you need it. Hey, pei, kuf, ayin, hey. Hafka'ah means he's excluded from it. And the Rav used to say that if a woman opts voluntarily to fulfill a mitzvah that she's exempt from, she can make a bracha on it, according to Rabbeinu Tam. But if an Eved volunteers for a mitzvah that he's exempt from, he cannot make a bracha. Because the Asher Kidshanu v'mitzvosav doesn't apply to him. He doesn't have the Kedushas Yisrael. He's mufka. Again, that's another long discussion, but I want to use the same logical structure here to ask about a katan. What is the status of a katan in mitzvahs? And I never heard my Rebbe discuss it, except he asked us once in Shir whether a katan has a Maisa mitzvah. And I think he quoted Reb Chaim, his grandfather, to say that a katan has a mitzvah, a Maisa mitzvah, because of the parsha called Shivcha Charufa. So a katan who's 9 years old, and he has a relationship with a Shivcha Charufa, who's a Shivcha Chetzia Baschorin, he has to bring a carbon for that. Again, he'll only bring the carbon later when he's a gadol. But that Maisa Bia is Machayev a katan. And there are other proofs that seem to indicate that a katan has a Maisa mitzvah. Rabbi Kiveger was of the opinion that a katan does not have a Maisa mitzvah. what I want to say is a lot easier if I assume that a Katan has no Maisa Mitzvah. He's Mufka. But that's not so simple. You could have entertained the idea that he's really included in the Chiyuv. He's not excluded, it's just a P'tur. The Torah went lenient and went easy, so to speak, on a Katan. Now, here's the rub. If we say that a Katan is Potter min mitzvahs, then it could be that we can find a case of a mitzvah that he's chayav in. And my example would be Talmud Torah. In the case of Talmud Torah, I have reason to suggest that since the Torah says that others have to teach him, that itself is a mechayev for him to study Torah. As we saw in the Gemara in Masechta Kiddushin, if a person has to be taught Torah, he has to study Torah. That's a corollary of the principle in the Gemara that a woman, since others don't have to teach her, she doesn't have to study Torah. So if the definition of a katan in mitzvahs in general is a p'tur, we have rights to investigate the possibility that in Talmud Torah it becomes a chiyuv, based on the fact that others have to teach him Torah. And that certainly will justify the Havamina and justify why the Rambam felt compelled to tell us that a katan is potter from Talmud Torah, which he doesn't have to tell us in every single mitzvah. But in Talmud Torah, there's a reasonable doubt and an argument that might lead us to the conclusion that since others have to teach him Torah, he himself has to study Torah. But I believe that the Rambam is of the opinion that a katan is completely excluded from mitzvahs, which means, in the language of the Talmud, he's lav bar chiyuva. The word bar here means to include you in a category. You're a bar hachi. You're a bar chiyuva. You're a bar mitzvah. Bar means you're included in X, Y, or Z, whatever it might be. In the case of a katan, yesh lachar, we have to analyze, is he a bar chiyuva with a p'tur, or he's a lav bar chiyuva? He's not included in any chiyuva whatsoever. And then nafkamina is going to be katan in Talmud Torah. If you're going to tell me that katan is really a bar chiyuva, just the Torah pater him up, so then in Talmud Torah, I have reason to believe that since the Torah says others have to teach him, he would now be obligated. But if you're going to tell me that katan in mitzvahs in general is a lav bar chiyuva, which means it's not just that the Torah exempt him from mitzvahs, but it means that he's excluded from mitzvahs. He's not in the parsha of mitzvahs. He doesn't even enter into the base of mitzvahs. He doesn't even come in. Then why should Talmud Torah be any different? The only problem is that the father has to teach him Torah. All right, that might be a special chiyuv on the father. Joe, are you with me?
I'm just trying to understand how you could think that he would be completely exempt, because he's eventually, we have with this child that eventually he's going to become part of it. There's a mitzvah of preparing him for that time.
Okay, so that might be a rabbinic mitzvah. That's called chinuch. We have to prepare him. But the actual heavy-duty mitzvah Talmud Torah, v'gisa bo yom v'layla, that you have to study Torah in order to know the Torah. You have to study Ben Sorah Morah, even if it's not relevant, because lo hoy v'lo nivra. That you have to study Torah, and therefore you might even be potter from other mitzvahs. I mean, that heavy kind of full-fledged, weighty obligation on the shoulders of a katan. The katan is not a bar hachi, he's not a bar chiyuva, he doesn't have the shoulders to obligate him and carry that weight. Chinuch, yes. Chinuch, let him go through the motions. Let's teach him, let's train him, let's get him used to taking a lulav on sukkahs, sitting in the sukkah. Let's train him to eat the matzah. maybe train him to daven and say Kriya. Everything is wonderful, but that's not a bar chiyuva. And therefore, on a doraisa level, we can establish that a katan is a lav bar chiyuva. And if he's a lav bar chiyuva, then for sure we have no way of establishing a chiyuv on a katan. Because even if the machayev is that others have to teach him, but he cannot accept a chiyuv. See, in Isha, it's different. In Isha, she's a bar chiyuva, just what the Torah says she's part. So if others have to teach her, then we have a Gili Milsa that she would have to study Torah. But the crux of the matter is that she doesn't have to be taught Torah. We don't have an obligation to teach a woman Torah. Therefore, she doesn't have to study Torah. But that all makes sense in the case of an Isha because she's included in mitzvahs. She has chiyuvim in mitzvahs. And logically, we would have extended Hachiv to include even Talmud Torah because it's Lav Zman Groma. So then we come up with, well, others don't have to teach her, and that's a Gili Milsa to teach me that she doesn't have to study and she doesn't have to teach. But in the case of a Katan, by contrast, he's out of the ballpark. He's not even a Bar Chiyuva. So there's no way, no how that you can impose a Chi of Talmud Torah on a Katan. And in that sense, now Talmud Torah falls back into the general rubric of all mitzvahs because he's a labar human mitzvahs. He's not an ish. If he's not an ish, he can't be chayav in mitzvahs.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, please.
David.
I
okay,
see the
so
Kota. Oh, there you go, David.
I just moved the Kaisel. Yeah, I'm on my phone. So, but anyway, so my question is, okay, so assuming that he's loved Baruch Chiyuba, he's not having any mitzvah at all, then how can he make a neder when he's 11 or 12 years old? There's no
You're
shaykhs
talking
to
about
do or anything else.
Mufla samach le'ish.
Yeah, so make a neder, it's chal, right? For nazir or anything else. So if he's no shaykhs to mitzvahs, it doesn't make sense. I don't think.
Yeah, you're right. That's like the Shivcha Charufa that I quoted before, that he's chayav in a korban because he had beer with a Shivcha Charufa at the age of 9. He's not a gadol. And you're asking
Mufla started by saying Talmud Torah is different than the other mitzvahs.
No, what we're saying is that at the end of the day, we want to put Talmud Torah back into the general package of all mitzvahs. Why? Because otherwise, how could the Rambam say that a katan is potiv in a Talmud Torah? So we're trying to defend the Rambam by putting at the end, again, the Havamina certainly that justifies the Rambam's need to tell me that I understand, because maybe a katan is shayach to mitzvahs. Ella, what the Torah patted him up in all mitzvahs, the Torah never patted him up in Talmud Torah because others have to teach him Torah. But if I want to justify the final conclusion of the Rambam, not the Salka Daita Rabmin of the Rambam, that a katan is potiv in Talmud Torah, then I'm tempted to want to put Talmud Torah back into the package of all mitzvahs, and that would make sense if in all mitzvahs he's mufka, and then we have the problem of mufla somus lish, and now David raised the problem we have the problem of
Shivcha
Rufa. Now David mentions the problem of
Nedarim.
Mufla Samach Lish.
Yeah.
So again, I'm not learning Nedarim now, far from it.
I'm sure.
But I'm just wondering if Mufla Samach Lish means that he himself is obligated to observe the neder, or that the neder is chal, and the nafkamina is for hatfasa. Right, because I could be matfis a neder onto another neder. So let's say Shimon took a neder, Reuven could be matfis his neder on Shimon's neder.
Yeah, Hareini.
Like Hareini Kamoscha, Hareini Nozik, all these different cases of atfasa. So I'm not sure. We have to check out, David, which would be, I'll give you this research project. You can ask AI, but don't rely on what they tell you in AI. It's just very unreliable. Although somebody said that this sefer that I have, Hagigei, somebody said, well, why don't you publish it in English? I said, I don't have time to translate it to English. He said, just give it to AI. Everything is AI today. You know what I mean? Like,
Of
that's your
course.
first name, your second name, your third name. Anyway, so somebody was fighting with AI, and finally, AI answered, I'm only a robot." What I'm saying? But getting back to this, so I would have to ask AI if a Katan himself, who's mufla samach leish, is obligated to observe his neder. I mean, that's an interesting question. But I definitely think that Shivcha Charufa is a starker raya against Rabbi Kivega. Rabbi Kivega assumes that a cotton doesn't have a Maisa at all. Actually, there's a Gemara in Bava Kama, this will conclude, about Rafram. Rafram burned somebody's star when he was a cotton,
Right.
and they wanted to force him to pay
They compare the go, yeah.
when he became a gadol for what he did as a cotton. Now, if you assume, which is a very stark assumption, that the chiyuv of Tashlumin Ezekiel is based on a Maisa Hezek, in Adam Amazik at least, then by burning the star, did the Katan have a Maisa Hezek? Otherwise, if he didn't have a Maisa Hezek, there's no way you could be Mechayim in Tashlumin when he became a Gadol. And it would
You're,
seem from that sugya that maybe a Katan does have a Maisa Avera, in this case, a Maisa Hezek. And that's very interesting to study the status of a cut.
so
Okay, Rabbi Sai.
you're also assuming that
Yeah.
you're done Dina de Garmi because their star is.
Right, I'm talking about Dina de Garmi, but even in Dina de Garmi, it's Adam Amazik after all is said and
No, I
done.
agree. Yeah.
You know what
Yeah.
I'm saying? It might
Yeah.
be, it's not like the real Mazik 100% because the
No.
star is not Gufa moment, but it
It's a piece of
is.
paper, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, then,
But
Rabbi
I like
Sai.
I like giving one chiluk shechus harufa that's different than different Maisa Vera. Okay, so let's say for example, okay, the reason is because the bia with the cotton and the shifcha, right? There's an actual physical thing that takes place. Whereas if somebody, let's say, I don't know, somebody is mavash. No, that's not an example. Some averas do not necessarily cause a change in reality. They sort of like a lot do, but maybe I can think perhaps some cases where they actually don't, and maybe that's what it means in these mufka. But something that actually is an actual Misa, you can't take it away. It happened, right? So to say there's no Misa by Bia, that's not true. There is a Bia.
Right, he's a Ben test.
Regardless of Baruch or not.
Right. All right, Rabbi Sai. I'm going to go to David.
Yeah.
And look, I'd like to, I'd like you to see my Sefer Hagigios. I just don't know how many Canadians are here in Israel that would be willing to schlep the Svarim for me. I don't know.
How was the first? You said you put it out by the different places. How did it go?